The ayes have it. Questions without notice. The member for Chifley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Can the Minister confirm that more than a year since this pandemic started, the only money the Morrison government has spent on Myrna vaccine manufacturing has gone to consultants, not scientists?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and if I just might say on indulgence, if I can congratulate the Leader of the House and his ascension. Every cloud has its silver lining. I thank the member for his question. So the mRNA technology that he is referring to—
Members on both sides.
The mRNA technology that he's referring to has, of course, been the subject of a McKinsey report into the capability and capacity for domestic manufacture. And, Mr Speaker, I know that there is limited ability to give some context, but I think it is important for the House to understand a couple of things about the messenger ribonucleic acid vaccines. They are a preform of protein, mRNA. The vaccines essentially trick the body into producing some of the viral proteins itself, and in considering a potential domestic manufacture capability for Australia, there are three very critical features to this new technology. The first is that it is a very, very new technology. The second is that the production and manufacture at scale of that technology is very complicated. It requires the production of a synthetic version of the mRNA. That uses the virus to build infectious proteins. The proteins must remain solitary. They then create some of the virus molecules themselves once put into the body, and the immune system detects those molecules.
Member for Corangamite.
The third issue is that it is very likely that this type of technology could become the next generation in immune science. There's no doubt about that. But it is still absolutely cutting edge. So for everyone listening today, the first mRNA technology which has found its way into the bodies of human beings has been in the context of COVID. So we've approached this issue with all of its complications with, I think, both confidence and realism. Confidence that Australia can and should have a domestic manufacture capability here, but with some realism that that is not a simple process. It's not a process, as has been reported in some outlets, that would take 3 to 6 months. It's going to be a significantly longer process than that. To understand that process, as the member noted in his question, we went through an audit last year to identify possible companies in Australia with the potential for mRNA capability. We went through an information generating process where there are 64 responses. We engaged McKinsey's. They produced a final report in 21 March of this year. We've gone through that report. It has obviously a range of in commercial confidence measures and information. It notes, I think, if I can say in summary to the House, that there is great confidence for Australia in terms of a capability to manufacture this type of technology, but to ensure that that manufacture is sustainable, that it is commercially viable and that it is at scale, that will require a breadth of manufacture, not just in vaccines but other therapeutic goods, and we are investigating that at present.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's 2021 budget will secure Australia's recovery and create a stronger economy that can fund the essential services Australians rely on?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question, and I thank her for her diligence over this past 18 months, as all members of this place have sought to do, to provide support to Australians through what has been a very difficult period in our nation's history. Tonight, Mr Speaker, the Treasurer will announce the coalition government's further plan to secure Australia's recovery. Mr Speaker, tonight's budget will once again show how we're protecting Australia against the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr Speaker, how we create jobs, how we guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on, whether it be in aged care or mental health, Mr Speaker, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. To build, Mr Speaker, a more resilient and secure Australia in what is increasingly an incredibly uncertain world, whether that uncertainty stems from the security of our region, the pandemic which we face, or the challenging climate which the world is faced with, Mr Speaker, over the next 30 years and beyond. Mr Speaker, our world does remain uncertain. The pandemic continues to rage. This will be our government's second pandemic budget tonight, Mr Speaker, because we are under no illusion that the pandemic continues to rage across the world as it has extended from the developed world now into the developing world, as we see the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in places like India, and indeed as it will continue to move across other parts of the world in the months ahead. Mr Speaker, it is against that pandemic background that tonight's budget is framed. We will continue to take responsible action to save lives and to save livelihoods, as our government has done throughout the course of this pandemic and the recession that it has caused. Mr Speaker, we will continue through our plan to secure Australia's recovery to continue to bring Australia and Australians through this terrible pandemic, while moving beyond emergency responses, as we have been doing for these last 18 months. We move into the recovery phase and continue to provide the support that both Australians need to protect their lives and to protect their livelihoods. Mr Speaker, these actions have ensured that even right now, that Australia has, compared to the rest of the world, we are living a way that the rest of the world envies, because of the way that in this country Australians have worked together, governments have worked together. The Commonwealth Government, Mr Speaker, has invested to ensure that lives and livelihoods have been protected. And indeed, there were 13 million Australians who were working in this country before the severity of the pandemic hit. Today, Mr Speaker, there are 13.1 million Australians working today, and that is after 900,000 Australians lost their jobs. More people working today than before the pandemic hit. The budget will secure the recovery.
The member for Chifley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. How many applications for funding to support the manufacture of mRNA vaccines in Australia has the government received, and how many have been funded?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology once again.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question. The member seems to consider that with this extremely advanced cutting-edge technology, the commercial and scientific future of which is imperfectly understood even by the experts in the production and manufacture and in the scientific community, that people come unsolicited to government in their dozens with proposals to establish that sort of manufacturing facility. What we have done is we have gone and insisted upon a very thorough analysis of the market through a very thorough process conducted by McKinsey's. They have spoken to the major players, of which there are only a handful. We are now considering that report. But what the question seeks to lead Australians to believe is that somehow such a production facility could have been up and running, or could be imminently up and running. And it is important for all Australians to understand that the actual science and commerciality of this technology speaks totally against that proposition.
I just say to the minister, members on my left will cease interjecting that, obviously, given the nature of the question, I've allowed him some context in all of that. However, this question was very specific. In fact, it was two very specific questions. And so I know, having given him that time, which is about half the time available, he'll really need to address those and or wind up his answer. The minister.
So there are only a tiny number of commercial entities who are even possibly able to do this, and we are in conversations with them. And that's what responsible governments do, based on the best information that is available. And it should be noted, Mr Speaker, that many said it was absolutely impossible to do what the government has done, which is to retool CSL so that they could produce the adenovirus AstraZeneca vaccine, but we did that. And we will investigate this technology and we will produce the result in due course.
Resume his seat. Members on my left, the minister has concluded his answer. The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormick government is securing our recovery by continuing to stimulate the economy and drive jobs through the rollout of infrastructure across Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Flynn for his question, Mr Speaker, and note that we were there last week at Gladstone Port, a very deep port, a very industrious harbour, Mr Speaker. And indeed, Mr Speaker, we were there announcing $5 million for the Auckland Hill precinct upgrade, $5 million for the hydrogen knowledge hub. And that wouldn't have happened but for the LNP, but for, indeed, the member for Flynn and for his advocacy. He asked me about economic recovery. He asked me about what we're doing as far as infrastructure projects, and there are many. The infrastructure budget today is $110 billion. Just as importantly, that is supporting 100,000 workers. The budget tonight will support an additional 30,000 workers. Shovels in the ground, excavators, building, doing. That's what we want. That's what we're getting. That's what we're delivering. There are more people with a job, as the Prime Minister has just said, in Australia today than there were prior to the pandemic, and that is something of which we all should be very proud. Some of our new infrastructure investments being added to the infrastructure pipeline over 10 years, $2 billion for the Greater Western Highway, the eastern and western sections, Katoomba and Lithgow.
Member for McEwen.
He's a recidivist, Mr Speaker. $2 billion investment to deliver a new Melbourne intermodal terminal in Victoria. $400 million more for upgrades to the Bruce Highway. And having travelled on it last week, I know that those upgrades are going to save lives. More investment for Metronet in Western Australia. The Truro Bypass in South Australia. National Network Highway upgrades in the Northern Territory. Bass Highway safety and freight efficiency upgrades in Tasmania, and the William Hovell Drive in the Australian Capital Territory was near there yesterday. And as Zed Zazelja and I were there, the motorists were honking at our press conference, and I know they were delighted. They're delighted, not just about the upgrades that we're doing in the ACT, but right across, acknowledging right across this wide brown land. We're getting on with creating jobs, with putting in the investment, with making opportunities, Mr Speaker. Every state and every territory has benefited, will benefit, and certainly into the future, with the announcements going to be made precisely here tonight. 7:30, look forward to it. The Treasurer is going to make some more exciting announcements about infrastructure, about regional Australia, because it's been regional Australia which has helped carry this nation through the pandemic, in agriculture, in resources, and making sure that Australia continues to have those investments and those opportunities into the future.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This government has underspent on its infrastructure announcements by an average of $1.2 billion every year for the 8 long years that it's been in office. How can Australians have any confidence it will deliver on the announcements made in this year's budget?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
So glad the Prime Minister has asked me to answer this question on his behalf and the government's behalf. Mr Speaker, now, I know, blessed are the cheesemakers, I know that Labor hasn't delivered a budget for nearly 10 years. They haven't delivered a surplus budget since 1989. 1989, surplus budget. That was the last time you did it.
Members on my left.
Look at them go! They know! Probably none of us were even here then. So, there is no underspend. This is how budgets work. Yeah, this is how budgets work. It's not come in spinner. They put you up to this.
The Deputy Prime Minister will just pause for a second. Members on my left, a lot of you have spent a lot of time wanting to get back in here. You're about to be straight out. The Deputy Prime Minister...
Out at the next election, Mr Speaker. Now,
I just got to ask the Deputy Prime Minister, didn't think it's possible, but he needs to be relevant to the question, okay? If you can just...
Mr Speaker, the federal government pays states and territories upon the completion of milestones. So when a state or territory gets the allocation, gets the commitment by the Commonwealth, they do the contracting, they do the tendering, they run the project, and when a certain amount of cement is put down, when a depth of a hole is built, when a pier is put up, Mr Speaker, we pay on milestones. So, if there's weather or if there's some other event, or indeed if a state just can't get on and do the job required, then the cheque doesn't get paid. But rest assured, Member for Ballarat, that money that, as you claim, might be underspent still goes into the overall budget for infrastructure, and it does get spent upon the completion of that job. And that's why we're getting on. And I can hear the Leader of the Opposition, yes, 8 years, 8 glorious years. You just thought you had it made when they gave you a small amount of money to spend. We're getting on and we're building the infrastructure that Australia, particularly regional Australia, which you forgot when in those 6 dysfunctional years under Kevin Rudd, under Julia Gillard, and then under Kevin Rudd again. We're getting on and we're building the infrastructure, whether it's dams, whether it's roads, whether it's the inland rail, and it's supporting 100,000 workers. And did I say in my previous question answer, I think I did, an additional 30,000 tonight in the budget. So we're getting on and we're spending the money that's required. And we also do it based on state priorities, yes, based on the territory priorities. And I'm happy to work with any ministers of any political colour, stripe or creed to get on and build the infrastructure that we need. And that's why when I advised them on Sunday night, gave them the heads up as a courtesy call, they all come back to me. The Labor ministers were delighted with the infrastructure spend that Josh Frydenberg is going to announce tonight.
Members on both sides. The Leader of the Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 1 in 3 of Australia's biggest corporations pays no tax. And while the rest of the country was hit hard during the pandemic, Australian billionaires' wealth increased by 1/3, with some doubling their wealth. Prime Minister, isn't it time to make the billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share so that we can make critical investments like getting dental into Medicare? We're a wealthy country, but many people are still struggling. So in tonight's budget, will you listen to the Greens and put in place a 6% tax on billionaires' wealth and a new super profits tax on big corporations making excessive profits?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I got a tip for the member for Melbourne. I won't be listening to the Greens, Mr Speaker. I won't be listening to the Greens, Mr Speaker, and neither will the Treasurer and the Australian people who value their jobs, Mr Speaker, and who value the strength of an economy, a strength of an economy which is what actually pays for essential services. This seems to be something that escapes the member for Melbourne and the Greens, and I expect that many who sit on that side, that it is the strong economy, businesses going out, employing people, investing, creating jobs, creating opportunities that drives an economy that pays for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, that pays for aged care, Mr Speaker, that pays for mental health care support, Mr Speaker, and all of the services. It pays for the pension. It pays for disability support. A strong economy, Mr Speaker, is what achieves that. And that is why tonight, Mr Speaker, you will see a budget that guarantees the essential services that Australians rely on, because it is a comprehensive further plan to secure the economic recovery of this country. Mr Speaker, that economic recovery, compared to what is happening around the world at the moment, Mr Speaker, is quite striking. There are a few developed countries in the world today that can say that there are more people employed today than there were before the pandemic hit. That, Mr Speaker, is a great achievement of Australians. Australians going out there working hard, running businesses, putting Australians in work, Mr Speaker, so they can pay taxes and ensure that the government can support the essential services that Australians rely on. We are the party of lower taxes, Mr Speaker, and I'll tell you why that is, Mr Speaker. We are the party of lower taxes because we believe that Australians should keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker. We believe a dollar kept in the hands of an Australian family is better than a dollar kept in the hands of the government, Mr Speaker. That's what we believe. We believe that. That's why we have put speed limits on taxation in this country, which the Labor Party has opposed at 2 successive elections. A speed limit on taxes that we apply on ourselves because we know higher taxes, Mr Speaker. We know higher taxes actually strike out the enterprise and initiative of Australians and Australians who are working hard for their own families in their own communities, Mr Speaker. We will remain the party of lower taxes. Those opposite, they are the ones, Mr Speaker, that on every occasion they know how to start spending, they never know how to stop, Mr Speaker. And that means, Mr Speaker, the party that said we should keep JobKeeper in place forever, Mr Speaker, they knew it had to be introduced, but they didn't know how to end it, Mr Speaker, because that was not the responsible decision that they were prepared to support. We will remain the party of responsible investment of taxpayers' money, and we will forever be the party of lower taxes.
Has concluded, and I give the call to the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Great question. Will the Minister please update the House on actions the Morrison government is taking to guarantee essential services by supporting women's health and well-being, including for those women suffering from breast cancer, as well as other health-related concerns?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it was my privilege to join the member for Higgins on Sunday, Mother's Day, at the launch of the $354 million within this budget for the National Women's Health Strategy. And the member for Higgins very graciously and movingly told of her own mother's passing to cancer. As part of that, we talked more generally about the challenges of cervical cancer and of breast cancer, a $100 million investment, the largest component within the Women's Health Strategy. But importantly, we learnt that 3,000 Australian women pass from breast cancer every year. Over 1,000 women pass from cervical cancer, but we may well be the first country in the world to eliminate or near eliminate cervical cancer with our screening programs and with our Gardasil program. Significantly, though, there's more work to be done. I met a young woman, still a young woman, Alison Day, not long ago. She has triple-negative breast cancer. It is stage 4, and by her own admission, it is only a question of time. She's a mother of 2 young children. And she pointed out, and it was very powerful, and this is one of the privileges of being in this House, that we meet people every day whose stories are real and powerful, that there was no program as yet for genetic testing, genomic screening, for women in this particular circumstance to have their cancer matched with the optimal medicine. And whilst we have the Zero Childhood Cancer Program, which does this, and the National Cancer Genomic Screening Program being led by the Garvan Institute, this was a new frontier. And so we have looked and we have listened to Ali and Ali's wish, and we are bringing forward, as part of this budget, a $5 million clinical trial program which will open immediately and close in July for missions to be put forward, clinical trials to be put forward through a competitive peer-reviewed basis for genomic screening to then lead to the matching with optimal medicines for triple-negative breast cancer and other low-survival breast cancers. And this will give real hope and real opportunity. At the same time, we are in discussion with Gilead, the company which sponsors a new breakthrough medicine, Troladex, in the United States, to bring that forward for assessment by the PBAC. They have agreed to bring that forward, and if it's approved, we will list it. And if it's listed, that will save lives. And today, is about giving Ali's wish reality.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In last year's budget, the government announced its signature JobMaker program would support 450,000 jobs, but the program only supported just 1,000 jobs. When the government failed to deliver its signature announcement from the last budget, how can Australians believe anything that it announces tonight?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I genuinely do thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, I quote his shadow treasurer, who said this after the last budget. He said the test for this budget is what it means for unemployment. If unemployment is too high for too long, then this budget and this government would have failed its central task. Mr Speaker, he said, you judge a budget by jobs and opportunities and what it says about the
Prime Minister, he needs to...
I'm coming to it, Mr.
Yeah, no, you need to...
I'm coming to it.
Well, you need to come to it now.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, I should say, about why the government should be believed in what we put tonight at tonight's budget. I was asked that question by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. That's what I was asked. They said after the last budget that the test, Mr Speaker—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I understand the Prime Minister's embarrassment about
just
the
Leader of the
JobMaker
Opposition
program.
needs to come to his point of order.
I get that.
No, members on my right, the member for Goldstein. The Minister. The Leader of the Opposition needs to come to his point of order.
It was a very specific question about the JobMaker program. The Prime Minister needs to talk about the JobMaker program. It shouldn't take too long.
I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, I did ask the Prime Minister to relate his answer to the material, but it was a very specific question followed by a very open-ended question, which members on my right, which talked about or asked the question how anything could be believed from tonight's budget. So I do think that does open it up somewhat. If it didn't have that in it, it would require a much tighter answer, but I'm listening to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So as the opposition put the test of our budget last time about what it meant for unemployment, I note that at the time we brought down our first pandemic budget, unemployment was at 7%, Mr Speaker. Today is it at 5.6%. It is at 5.6%. By the Labor Party's own standard, Mr Speaker, the economic recovery plan that we put in place in our first pandemic budget, Mr Speaker, has met their test and has exceeded it, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, this is not the first time. It was the Leader of the Opposition who said back in July of last year, he said 400,000 more will join the unemployment cruise by Christmas. But indeed 300,000 jobs were created during the same period, Mr Speaker. He said the Morrison government had no plan for jobs and no plan for recovery in June of last year, but yet another 500,000 jobs after that were created, Mr Speaker. During the course of this pandemic, this government has acted, Mr Speaker, in concert with Australians, in concert with other state and territory governments, to do one important thing, and that is to put Australians back in work. And today there are 13.1 million Australians who are in jobs today. Before the pandemic there were 13 million, Mr Speaker. And the Cassandras and the Chicken Littles over there have, Mr Speaker, on numerous occasions, Mr Speaker, said that people were literally going to go off cliffs. That is a direct quote from the Leader of the Opposition. But the alternative, Mr Speaker, well, he asked, Mr Speaker, he says on the 19th of June, the truth is today, exactly 100 days until JobKeeper stops, people literally will fall off a cliff. That's his exact quote. That's his exact quote, Mr Speaker.
Members on my
so
right.
much for the hubris and exaggeration of the Leader of the Opposition. If there's a person who cannot be believed in this place, Mr Speaker, it is the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, whose economic credibility is in complete and utter tatters.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is focused on the needs and priorities of Australian women, particularly their economic security and their personal safety?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She knows that women from all corners of Australia and all walks of life will be listening carefully to the Treasurer tonight to hear about our strengthened and ongoing commitment to women at every stage of their lives. Mr Speaker, the Cabinet Women's Task Force is building on the achievements of this government, and I'm reminded that there is always more work to do, such as the support that we will continue to show to our frontline workers. The frontline workers that work in Betty's Place in my hometown of Albury and women's refuges across the country, where I've met them and been impressed by their compassion, their resourcefulness, the spirit they have in confronting really difficult and tragic incidents on a daily basis. We are committed to women's safety, their economic security, their health and indeed their leadership opportunities. Mr Speaker, we're committed to women at the hardest of times. I recently sat in the Downing Centre Sydney Local Court with victims and their advocates as they went through apprehended domestic violence order hearings. As Women's Safety New South Wales CEO Hayley Foster told me, the universal access to justice and frontline support services and advocacy has never been more vital. Now, since 2013, we've committed more than $1 billion to women's safety. The current National Action Plan concludes in June 2022, and we will have an opportunity to really reflect on the progress we've made and the road ahead. Everyone will have their chance to have their say on the development of the next national plan. And at the next National Women's Safety Summit, we will continue to examine not only women's safety, but improving health outcomes, economic security, financial independence and leadership opportunities. The national plan is complemented by the Roadmap to Respect in response to the Respect at Work report, which outlines the reforms and measures this government is taking to combat sexual harassment and inequality in the workplace. Financial independence is critical to safety and security, and we're focused on increasing the record-high workforce participation rates for Australian women. We've already achieved much. We want to continue to narrow the gender pay gap, currently the lowest it's been. Families not only need security in the workplace, they need flexibility and choice, which is why we will be investing an additional $1.7 billion in the annual childcare subsidy cap to give women choice. So to women all over Australia, whether you'll be working in our cities, raising and caring our families, whether you've just started to call Australia home or you've lived a lifetime in regional Australia, we are here, we are listening and we are responding.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the central program announced in last year's budget, JobMaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that instead of the 450,000 jobs that was announced, just 1,000 jobs have actually been achieved? Is it also a fact that just $2 million of the $4 billion that was announced for this failed scheme has been spent?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to provide an update on these matters. Mr Speaker, as we assembled our policies throughout the course of this pandemic, we were going to throw everything we had at it, Mr Speaker, to ensure we kept Australians in jobs. Everything we could do, every tool we could bring together, we were going to put in place to support jobs in this country, and that included the hiring credit, Mr Speaker, which, as usual, the Leader of Opposition supported and opposed in the same breath, as he has in pretty much every measure we've been engaged in with the course of this pandemic. And the JobMaker hiring credit, Mr Speaker, was one of those measures. Now, when you put these measures together, I don't care, Mr Speaker, whether it's the JobMaking hiring credit, the Boosting Apprentices scheme, the JobMaker program, the cash flow boost, the Job Trainer program. I don't care which of these programs, Mr Speaker, delivers the result. just so long as the result is achieved. And I'll tell you what the result is. 13.1 million people in jobs, Mr Speaker, today compared to 13 million before the pandemic started. But I do note on the hiring credit, Mr Speaker, what has occurred? What has occurred is at the time we put that together, the jobs market over the course of the March quarter actually proved to be much stronger because of all the myriad of measures the government had put in place. Mr Speaker, some 440,000 more people employed in March. Now, that figure has a bit of a familiar ring to it, doesn't it? 440,000 people, more employed people in the March quarter than we had forecast in the budget. So, Mr Speaker, whichever road we have to take to get people back in jobs, that's what my government's doing, Mr Speaker. Whether it's the JobMaker hiring credit, whether it's the boosting apprenticeships program, Mr Speaker, and the extending of the apprenticeship support, which we thought, Mr Speaker, we would be able to get 100,000 apprentices in the space of 12 months. We got it in 5, Mr Speaker, and we extended the program, and that is in place, Mr Speaker, as we speak today. So the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, can complain about the measures that we're putting in place to get Australians into jobs. He can have a bet each way, as he does on every single issue, particularly when it comes to the economy, Mr Speaker. But I tell you what, Mr Speaker, we'll get on with the job of creating jobs for Australians. Tonight's budget, Mr Speaker, is about securing that economic recovery. It is about creating those jobs. It is about guaranteeing the essential services that Australians rely on. It is about proving up and building that resilience that Australians need in a time of great uncertainty, both in our region and more broadly as we face this pandemic, Mr Speaker. This government, Mr Speaker, has been producing the policies and plans that have kept Australians in work, that have saved lives and have saved livelihoods, while those on the other side have bickered and complained.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting Australian families, including in my electorate of Lindsay, to reduce the cost of living and to take on more work if they choose to?
The Minister for Education and Youth.
Member for Lindsay for her question and for Member for Lindsay's tremendous advocacy of Western Sydney. And as the Member for Lindsay knows, the focus of this government is supporting Australians into work and supporting our post-COVID economic recovery. And that's exactly why, Mr Speaker, just over a week ago, we announced a further $1.7 billion into childcare subsidies to remove barriers for parents, and particularly for mums, who want to return to work or want to take on more hours. And, Mr Speaker, this policy is very much targeted at where it is needed most. And that is for those families who have 2 or more children in childcare, because despite the fact that those hourly fees may be modest, if you've got 2 or more kids in childcare, they can add up, Mr Speaker. So we're increasing the subsidy on the 2nd and 3rd child up to 95%, and we're also removing the annual cap so that no family will ever hit that cap and therefore create a disincentive to work. Now, Mr Speaker, we estimate that this will help 250,000 families across the country, and that includes 1,700 families in the Member for Lindsay's electorate. And it means that a family in the Members for Lindsay's electorate who might be earning, say, $110,000, which is the median amount for those families in childcare, and if they've got 2 kids in full-time care, they'll be $120 per week better off. Mr Speaker, you might be a single mum earning $65,000 and with a couple of kids and wanting to work or needing to work that extra day, that 5th day of the week. That particular person will be $71 per week better off as a result of this particular package. But, Mr Speaker, it's not just good for those individual families who will benefit from this package, but it's also good for the economy. And Treasury estimates that it will be a $1.5 billion increase to GDP as a result of this package, because the equivalent of 40,000 people will be doing an extra day a week of work, Mr Speaker. And of course, Mr Speaker, this builds on the tremendous amount that we've already put into childcare. Since coming to office, our childcare assistance has increased 77%, Mr Speaker. 280,000 more families have their child in childcare than they did when we first came to office, and women's workforce participation is at record levels, in part because of our childcare policy. Mr Speaker, we believe in choice for families to work if they want to, and we'll back them all the way in order to do exactly that, and that's what this childcare policy does.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that his government has failed to achieve its forecasts on wages in every one of the last 7 budgets? Why should any wage forecast released tonight in the 8th budget be believed?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Treasury forecasts that are contained in every budget, which are prepared by Treasury.
Prime Minister will pause. Members will cease interjecting. Prime Minister will pause for a second. Members will cease interjecting. I need to be able to hear the answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, it may come as a mystery to the Leader of the Opposition. I know he didn't spend too much time on the Expenditure Review Committee when they were in government, almost as little time as he did on the National Security Committee, Mr Speaker. I've never known someone who spent so much time in the parliament and has so little experience when it comes to economic and national security policy. But, Mr Speaker, Treasury, Mr Speaker, prepares the forecasts independently for the government in every single budget, Mr Speaker, and they are based on the understanding of circumstances at the time. And, Mr Speaker, they will do that again tonight. And, Mr Speaker, we have always sought, as a government, to ensure that as Treasury frame those forecasts, they do so conservatively, Mr Speaker. A very good example of that is the estimate that is made on iron ore prices, for example, Mr Speaker. And the purpose of all of those estimates, the purpose of all of those assumptions, Mr Speaker, is to ensure that the government can base its spending decisions on revenue estimates that are reliable, Mr Speaker. And the fact is that each of those budgets, particularly I was responsible for as Treasurer, Mr Speaker, and as Prime Minister, we have seen revenue estimates, with the exception of the pandemic, Mr Speaker, hitting from the 18-19 budget, Mr Speaker, then going, I should say, the 19-20 budget. We have seen those revenue estimates exceeded, Mr Speaker, exceeded.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question goes directly to the wages forecasts and no other section of the budget. It goes to how much people are paid, and why is it that the government always says they're going to get more in their pockets than they end up with in those wages forecasts, every single budget?
Yes, the question was about one policy topic and one policy topic only. The Prime Minister.
I take the point of order and I take the interjection. I'll tell you why. Because we cut their taxes, Mr Speaker. Because under our government they get to keep more of what they earn because we have reduced the taxation burden, Mr Speaker,
I just say to the Prime Minister,
Australians. This is what
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The microphone's off. I just say to the Prime Minister, it wasn't about taxation policy. It was about wages policy and the forecasts in the budget.
I was diverted by the interjection and the point of order by the Manager of Opposition Business, Mr Speaker. But as I was explaining to those opposite, Mr Speaker, the forecasts in the budget, which include the wage forecasts, combined with all the other forecasts in the budget to make an assessment of revenue estimates upon which we base our spending decisions. This may come as a mystery to those opposite, but that's called responsible financial management, Mr Speaker. It's what our government does, and that's why our revenue estimates, Mr Speaker, have always proved to be quite conservative. And that means we don't spend money that's not there, Mr Speaker. We don't do that, Mr Speaker. We make our spending decisions carefully and to deal with the circumstances we're faced with as a government. Now, what we have done as a government over the course of this pandemic is stepped up to ensure that the Australian economy has performed like few others in the world, Mr Speaker. That may have escaped the notice of the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, but I know Australians like the fact that they're back in work, and the people who have achieved that are Australians, Mr Speaker, and we'll keep backing them in, and we'll back them in again tonight.
And I call the honourable member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is strengthening Australia's resilience to natural disasters?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question and acknowledge the fact that representing North Queensland, he understands better than most the impacts of natural disasters, but so too do many in this House over the last couple of years. The challenges we face, whether it be floods or cyclones or bushfires, we as a nation have had to pull together. And we heard those harrowing stories replayed during the Royal Commission into Natural Disasters. And I'm pleased to say that just on 6 months since that report was handed to the government, we have, as a federal government, completed 8 of the 14 recommendations to the federal government. And last week we announced one of those recommendations in bringing together the recovery agencies of the bushfire with the drought and flood agencies together into one national recovery agency, making sure there's a coordination of the nearly $11 billion put for drought, the nearly $3.3 billion for floods and $2 billion for fires is rolled out in a coordinated way with a new and enhanced Emergency Management Australia. But we've also established Climate Services Australia, bringing together and collecting the data from 10 agencies, whether that be the Bureau of Meteorology, Geoscience Australia, or whether it be from CSIRO and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. What we want to do is be able to give those in emergency management across the country real-time data to be able to make decisions. And what that does in a practical way for someone in North Queensland is if there's a cyclone about to hit their community, then we will be able to tell those state authorities the number of households that will be impacted, the age of those households and the number of inhabitants, so they can make preemptive decisions about the resources that are going to be required to be there to help them in the immediacy of that natural disaster. We're also looking at mitigation works. I'm proud to say that yesterday, the first of the $50 million under the ERF, I announced 22 projects across the country for mitigation works in flooding, and we'll be reopening that ERF program now that we've got it up and going for another $50 million. But we also announced, as part of the mitigation works last week, is further funding, $600 million, $200 million to support households. And it builds on the household program that we already run in Queensland. We're allowing households to get grants for between $5,000 and $30,000 to do renovations to their home to make them fit for purpose, to make them cyclone-proof, make them flood-proof, to be able to have those undertakings on their own property and to also reduce their insurance premium. In North Queensland alone, we've seen up to a reduction of $310 in their insurance premium. And then we've looked at community mitigation works, $400 million to complement the $50 million in ERF to ensure that we don't just look at flood, but we look at fire and every other disaster that may be mitigated with capital works. We're asking the states to come with us. This is a dual responsibility. But this government, along with the states, will stand shoulder to shoulder with Australians here and into the future.
The Minister's time has concluded, and I call the member for Hotham.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that his record on aged care includes up to 2/3 of aged care residents malnourished, maggots in wounds, 685 COVID deaths, 27,000 older Australians who've tragically died waiting for a home care package and $1.7 billion in cuts? Why would Australians trust the Prime Minister to fix an aged care system that his decisions and his government have brought to its knees?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for her question, and I would invite her this evening to listen carefully to the Treasurer's response tonight in the budget, where tonight also we will release our full response to the Royal Commission to Aged Care that I commissioned, Mr Speaker, not long after I took on the role of Prime Minister. That Royal Commission into Aged Care, Mr Speaker, has provided us with a wealth of information to ensure that we can deliver a response tonight, Mr Speaker, that addresses the challenges that have been faced, not just in recent times, as the Royal Commission highlighted, but going back over several decades. Now, Mr Speaker, responding to the challenges of aged care in this place has, over quite a long period of time until the last few years, been, Mr Speaker, an act of bipartisanship. I remember indeed when the Shadow Minister, Mr Speaker, for Health now, formerly for health, Mr Speaker, now for health I should say, Mr Speaker, was the minister. He worked closely with the opposition and we sought to supporting them that. Now, Mr Speaker, as the Royal Commission has reported, there are many challenges in this space, and we will respond to those wholeheartedly tonight, but it won't be the first time. Because, Mr Speaker, in response to the member's question, I note this, that real growth in aged care funding of this government, Mr Speaker, has increased
Member
by
for Hotham
50%.
has asked her question.
50%, Mr Speaker, from when we came to government to the current year. It has increased from $14.2 billion, Mr Speaker, to $24.3 billion. And I'm told by an interjection, Mr Speaker, that does that take into account for population? Well, let me tell you, Mr Speaker, the increase in the population aged over 65 over that period of time is 23%. The real growth in funding for aged care from this government has been 50%, Mr Speaker. And in addition to that, home care packages, Mr Speaker, have increased by 194.86%. So, Mr Speaker, in response to growing demand, this government has been taking steps year after year after year to increase support, to ensure that we increase in-home aged care places, that we increase support to the residential aged care sector, and tonight, Mr Speaker, we will take another bold step in addressing the very serious concerns in aged care. The question for the Labor Party is, will they play politics with this, or will they engage with the government to ensure we work together to fix what is an intractable problem, Mr Speaker, that has impacted on governments of Labor, of Liberal and Nationals for decades, Mr Speaker. We will step up tonight. The test is on the Labor opposition as to whether they will join us and step up also.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House how the Morrison government is investing in our Northern Australian defence facilities and, importantly, how we are working to strengthen our vital alliance with the US?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and for his great interest in the Australian Defence Force and the support of the personnel at the Gallipoli Barracks. We were there only a week or two ago and we engaged with the troops on the ground and we were welcome. It was a great opportunity to listen to those members of the ADF who make a great sacrifice for our country. Their families give up a lot of time when their mums or dads are deployed and, Mr Speaker, we want to make sure that they have the best possible conditions to deploy to. And the government has made an announcement in this budget that we will have $750 million spent in the Northern Territory to upgrade facilities there, training facilities. We know at the moment, Mr Speaker, we have about 15,000 Australian Defence personnel in the region. We know that as of next month we will start to have about 2,200 US Marines, which is a doubling of the number that we had last year, training up in Darwin as part of that force rotation. They will work alongside the members of the Australian Defence personnel. And, Mr Speaker, this investment builds on the money that we're putting into facilities right across the north of Australia. We have a total of $8 billion being invested into facilities in the Northern Territory over the next decade. We have a further $1.1 billion that we'll spend in central and northern Queensland and approximately $800 million in northern Western Australia. And, Mr Speaker, when we talk about the budget tonight, making sure that it will secure Australia's recovery and create a stronger economy, it will also talk about how we intend to keep Australia safe. In tonight's budget, Mr Speaker, we will further detail our commitment to the Australian Defence Force, our continued expenditure not only in the personnel but in the infrastructure that's required to support them, Mr Speaker. We will make sure that we offer Australia every defence possible in a very uncertain period of history. And, Mr Speaker, nobody kids themselves in terms of what we need to do as a country to keep us safe and to make sure that we can keep our regional partners safe, to make sure that we can work alongside the United States, our most important alliance partner. Along with our Five Eyes partners, Mr Speaker, we provide stability in our region. And the fact that we can manage the economy well, the fact that we have responded to COVID in a way that most other countries around the world have not been able to do, Mr Speaker, has meant that we can invest additional money into the Australian Defence Force, and we will. Not just tonight, Mr Speaker, but over the decades ahead. And the Australian Defence Force personnel know that when we say that we are back to business and that we have their backs, Mr Speaker, they know that this government believes it, that we will act on it, and we will make sure that we continue to invest in the best defence force in the world.
The member for Maribyrnong.
My question.
The member for Maribyrnong has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. For 8 months before 23-year-old Liam Danher choked to death during an epileptic seizure in his sleep, his family fought the government for a $445 seizure mat that they say would have saved his life. Given what the government knows now, including that the legal and administrative cost of fighting the family was much more than the cost of the seizure mat itself, would it have handled things differently and just accepted the claim?
The Prime Minister has
the member for his question, and I will ask the Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme to respond.
The Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I note that a similar question was asked by the responsible minister in the Senate, and she has said she'll come back to the Senate with specific details around the legal costs. Notwithstanding that, and that the responsible minister will come back to the Senate and will ensure that response is given to the member as well. I think it's important for all of us to recognise the death of any participant is absolutely tragic, and especially in circumstances where deaths can be largely preventable. We all in this House, and especially the Morrison government, are committed to a nationally consistent set of quality and safeguard systems across Australia, and we've implemented a number of major reforms over the last 12 months to consistently deliver a strong and consistent protections for every participant in the NDIS. That includes, on a rolling, rotating basis, calling 78,000 vulnerable participants each year, especially during the pandemic, to ensure that Australians felt supported and had the necessary supports they need. The Minister will continue to work with the state and territory disability ministers to ensure we can strengthen the issues, especially as we connect with state and territories on healthcare, justice, out-of-home care, and indeed for participants who are at significant risk of harm. The intent being that there is a no wrong door approach to identifying vulnerabilities or supports that are needed. In late 2020, all disability ministers discussed this critical work on how we'd strengthen the support and protections for people with disability to ensure those vulnerable or at harm or that need supports can get there quickly. There will be ongoing work that the disability ministers right across the state and territory will continue to do to ensure we maximise the support for participants, especially those vulnerable participants.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's investment in world-class defence infrastructure, like that she's seen in my electorate last week, is promoting regional job opportunities and ensuring Australian Defence Force has the capability that they need to keep Australians safe?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question. Also thank him for being such a champion for Northern Australia as well. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's $270 billion investment in defence capability is something that we're very proud of, but it's not just about transforming ADF equipment and platform. It's also about empowering defence industry to deliver the infrastructure that the ADF needs to be able to operate, train and also to maintain the new equipment that is delivered by our Australian industry. Mr Speaker, just last week I was delighted to join with the Prime Minister and the very popular member for Leichhardt in Cairns to announce this government's investment of $155 million in investment infrastructure at HMAS Cairns. Mr Speaker, I think we all know that Cairns has done it pretty tough during COVID. their tourism industry has certainly been severely impacted by COVID. So I'm sure the good people in Cairns and that broader region are thrilled with our investment in HMAS Cairns, which will create more jobs in that region. Managing contractor Watpat Construction is committed to 80% for local contractors in their contract, which is great news, and each one of those contractors will then target 10% participation for Indigenous employment. Again, great news for Cairns and the broader region. Mr Speaker, at its peak, the construction phase is expected to create some 180 new jobs. Great news. This, as I said, will create more jobs for the locals, which is good news for Cairns and, of course, critical for our national security. Mr Speaker, Queensland will also reap the benefits of a recently announced $53 million investment in the Shoalwater Bay training area. And this is the latest in a series of local contracts which has seen local businesses sharing some $157 million worth of investment from this federal government. And something that I know that the local member for Capricornia, she's very passionate about. So I know that this is good news for her as well. Our investment will deliver some 450 jobs at its peak, meaning more opportunities for local businesses and tradies and professionals that they employ. And just one good example is a company called Belliquip. Belliquip is a local company in central Queensland. They're going to provide a range of earth-moving and civil services critical to delivering the much-needed infrastructure in that region. Mr Speaker, our investment in HMAS Cairns and the Shoalwater Bay training area shows that defence industry in Australia is not just about the shipbuilders or the engineers delivering the ships or the vehicles. The local tradies, the local earth movers, those locally owned family building companies, they are just as critical to the defence of our nation. They are important for our major infrastructure projects, and we are incredibly proud